Good morning, and welcome to our very first nonprofit spotlight event. My name is Hillary Stone, and I am a senior advisor for donor services here at the Columbus Foundation. These nonprofit spotlight events are intended to shine a light on key issues and opportunities impacting our community, as well as the leaders and the nonprofits on the front line addressing them. Today's session will focus on digital inclusion and the steps that are being taken to advance digital equity in our region and beyond. Before we get into things, just a few quick housekeeping items. Please feel free to engage with one another or elevate any technical issues you might be experiencing by utilizing the chat feature. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit those using the Q&A feature and not the chat. Questions in the Q&A can be upvoted by others if you have the same question as somebody else. Closed captions are on by default, but if you would like to turn that off, please select the transcription button at the bottom of your screen and simply click Hide Subtitle. Finally, today's presentation is being recorded. That said, we still want to encourage you to actively and openly engage in this conversation. Now, in the present, as the great French existentialist philosopher Albert Camus wrote, real generosity toward the future lies in giving all to the present. Or in the less profound words of 20th century American performer Vanilla Ice, stop, collaborate, and listen. Today, to discuss digital equity, we welcome Angela Siefer, founder and executive director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Heather Tsavaris, principal consultant for community well-being, design, and impact at the Columbus Foundation, and Matthew Martin, director of community research at the Columbus Foundation. Matt will kick us off today by introducing the topic, as well as highlighting some of the work that has been happening here in the Central Ohio region. In his role at the Columbus Foundation, Matt is responsible for research, development, and implementation of effective social investments that strengthen and improve our community. With a depth of knowledge in urban planning and community development, Matt leads the Foundation's grant-making initiatives in the areas of neighborhood revitalization, affordable housing, and digital equity. Without further ado, please take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Hillary, and good morning, everyone. I want to start by just a brief framing of the issue of digital equity and the digital divide, as you may have also heard it described. This is something that existed before the pandemic, that being the digital divide and a lack of digital equity. And it's something that's going to outlast the pandemic. But it's something that in the last 2 years we've seen more acutely than ever because of the need to work, learn, do healthcare, do so many things in life virtually, remotely. We know more about what it is this side of the pandemic, how it affects our community, and we've begun to, as a community, align partners across the community to address it holistically and no longer just the most urgent needs as in the early days of the pandemic, such as getting Chromebooks to students so that they can continue school and things like that. When we think about digital equity and inclusion, those terms can sort of feel a bit nebulous. They're in need of further definition, which is something we will get into in our conversation today, both with Angela and Heather. But I wanted to share just a brief story to kind of illustrate some of the dynamics of digital equity or lack thereof. So for Christmas this past year, I purchased some show tickets for my parents. They don't live in the Columbus area, but they were able to come down recently for the show. I found out about that show on the internet. I bought the tickets for that show on the internet. And when we got to the restaurant that we took my parents to before the show, we used our phones to access the menu of the restaurant. I sent that via text, the menu, to my parents at the restaurant while we were there, which of course before that, we paid for parking at a meter with our phones. I was able to drop my parents off at the door, saving them Uber and parking in addition. When they got to the door, of course, they had to show the tickets that I shared with them by texting them a screenshot of those tickets. They had to scan those at the door. I say all that not because that is the most acute or most urgent aspect of the digital divide, but because it illustrates how even some of the most simple activities in our society now require technological acumen, require access to devices, the internet, and more. So when we're talking about digital equity, we don't just mean one aspect of that. We don't just mean having broadband, right? Or just having broadband infrastructure. Access to the internet is a lot of things. It is about having access to infrastructure, an internet subscription, home broadband that's affordable, that's reliable, that's high enough speed and quality to do all the things that you need to do with the internet. It's about access to devices and the right devices for the right jobs at the right time. And of course, it's about skills and competencies that enable us to do all the things that we need to do using technology. So we'll talk a lot more about those aspects of the digital divide and what it means to pursue digital equity. When we entered the pandemic, Columbus was behind pretty significantly on this issue, thinking about it collectively, thinking about it strategically. And over the past 2 years, we've done a lot of catching up. We've had we've been a quick study. We've had a learning curve that was made more shallow by at least 3 things that I would point out to you this morning. The first is simply coming together. In the early weeks and months of the pandemic, conversations among community leaders here at the Columbus Foundation, at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, and at the Columbus Metropolitan Library were the beginnings of what has since become a broader coalition known as the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition. This coalition has met consistently throughout the pandemic and continues to work together to build a strategy and a sustainable plan for how we can make sure that everyone has access to the tools, the devices, internet, and skills and competency building opportunities to do everything that they need to do in this community, from working to learning to healthcare to just keeping up with friends, family, coworkers, and community. So forming that coalition, coming together to work on this together was a big part of us catching up as a community and starting to really work on this issue in a collective and systematic way. The second would be what Heather is going to talk more about this morning, and that is the human-centered design approach that we took. So even before the pandemic, the Columbus Foundation was helping to really begin to help change the way we think about problem solving in the community, and doing so in a way that also contributes to an increased sense of belonging for people across the community. Heather will talk more about that, but it's important to note that over the last couple of years, we've sought to address the digital divide and pursue digital equity, not just among community experts and leaders, but by involving learning with and learning from members of our community who have not traditionally been part of these types of processes, learnings, planning, and strategy development. So we'll learn more about that this morning as well. And lastly, I would say that our community's access to national experts and the guidance of leaders like Angela, who we have on the call this morning, has also really contributed to our ability as a community to learn, to align ourselves strategically, and to really begin to tackle the digital divide in a holistic way. So I want to next introduce our two guests and pass it over to Angela to further give detail and insight about this issue. Angela helped found the National Digital Inclusion Alliance just a few years ago in 2015, but has been working in this field that we now call digital inclusion since 1997. And if you've followed the trajectory of the internet since then, you know that a lot has changed and that has been a long battle to work toward inclusion and equity with respect to technology. She's helped physically set up computer labs in underserved areas, managed broadband conferences, conducted research, managed digital inclusion programs, and assisted with the Department of Commerce's broadband adoption toolkit. She's also testified before Congress about these issues and been an expert across the field for years. She serves on the board of directors of the Schools, Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition, and Government Technology Magazine named her one of their top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers of 2019. And she more recently received the Parker Award from the United Church of Christ in 2021. And then I'll also introduce Heather Tsavaris, who, as Hillary mentioned, currently serves as the principal consultant for community well-being, design, and impact at the Columbus Foundation, where she leads community well-being measurement and spearheads efforts to improve community well-being through partnership with community residents. She's worked across many sectors, including the federal government, the private sector, and the philanthropic sector, to develop and implement innovative and award-winning solutions to some of the world's most difficult challenges. With that, I will turn it over to Angela to take us a little deeper into this topic.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. I do live in Columbus, Ohio, and it is super fun always to talk to folks in Columbus. For the majority of my career, that has not been my reality. I often knew more about what was going on in Kansas City or Portland than I did in Columbus. So I really love how much progress Columbus has made during the pandemic, Central Ohio in general, Franklin County, right? That there's so much activity now, and I'm so proud of everything that's occurring here. As Matt noted, I helped found NDIA about 8 years ago. We realized that there was decision-making going on in the federal government, and they had no idea that local digital inclusion practitioners existed. They didn't understand their expertise, they didn't understand their challenges, and that information needed to make its way to those policymakers if we were to have policies that were going to support the folks on the ground doing the work. And those folks doing the work are community-based organizations, libraries, housing authorities, local governments. It's folks who are already interacting with populations that tend to be disconnected. So in the US, that digital inclusion work, it came from the ground. It was not a top-down, somebody saying, hey, this is what needs to be done. It was very much organizations and individuals who are already working in their community saying, hey, we see something here. One of my board members is Wanda Davis. She's in Cleveland. And for her, it was taking her mom to the doctor and the nurse leaving her mom to fill out forms in front of a computer and her mom having no idea what she was supposed to be doing with this computer. And so that's the moment when she was like, oh, okay. My mom is not alone in this. And so she formed the Ashbury Senior Community Computing Center. It's on the east side of Cleveland. It's in a neighborhood. It has a storefront. It's adorable. If you ever have a chance to go to Cleveland and see. Wanda is one of those people for me who, like, I do my work for people like Wanda, right? Because she's the one who's like, I see a problem and I'm going to fix this problem. And she does it with the community, just as Heather's going to describe to you that Columbus is embarking on a similar path of doing it with the community, not just for the community. So NDIA, the way we structure ourselves is that we hear what's going on the ground, right? We provide guides, we learn from folks, we write it up, it turns into a guide or a tool, and then we're able to support a lot of the work that is occurring here in Columbus and around the country with these tools and these guides and this advice. But we also then take what folks are doing at the local level, we learn from that, take it to policymakers so that policies sometimes get created in a way that's useful for folks locally. But then also when those policies do get created, sometimes we need to interpret them because, you know, legalese, government language can be hard to understand, and make it more accessible to folks on the ground who are doing the work, right? So we are that channel back and forth. And through the pandemic, you won't be surprised, lots of folks were like, oh, did you know there's a digital divide? And we were like, yes, we do. Would you like to be part of the solution? And that was an amazing point for those of us who had been doing the work for a long time to get lots more folks engaged in the solution and to not have to talk about the fact that there is a digital divide. I spent way too much time prior to the pandemic explaining to people that there are others who don't have access to technology. Now I don't really have to explain that anymore. I think all those photos of kids doing homework in parking lots was so heartbreaking, and it got to people so quickly that now we're able to focus on, okay, how do we solve this, right? What are those solutions? And it's not a quick and easy solution. You can't just buy a bunch of hotspots or a bunch of computers and be like, solve the digital divide, right? It's a little more complicated than that. One of the first things NDIA did was create definitions. So I'm going to put the link for that in the chat. There's a lot of information on our website. It can be a little overwhelming. There's so much there. So we are very much about open source information. So that's a good place to start, is those definitions. Digital equity is the goal. That's where we want to get to. Individuals and communities having full access to information and communication technology to do whatever it is they need to do. And then digital inclusion, these are the activities. This is that affordable home broadband that meets the needs of the user, the device that meets the needs of the user, mobile phone, not always meeting the needs of the user, even though it seems like everybody has one, it's insufficient. The digital literacy skills and training piece of it, where does one get that, right? So some folks teach themselves, that's great. For lots of us, it doesn't work like that. We need a little bit more support. Who's doing that? Libraries, community-based organizations. Is it convenient? Does it work with their schedule? Is it in the language that they need? Is it the cultural support that they need along with it? Tech support, when something breaks, who do you call? Not everybody can afford the Geek Squad, so there has to be an option to make sure everybody can do this. And it's no longer really an option. It's hard for folks to say, I just don't do technology. Could you get a COVID shot if you don't do technology, or you don't have somebody helping you with technology? How are you going to get access to any of your benefits? Apply for unemployment without the internet? Nope, not going to happen. Right. So it's turned into this thing where it's not a choice anymore. We used to think about it as this nice to have. That's not our reality. We may not like that that's not our reality, but it's still our reality. And so while we're helping folks have access to things offline, we also need to be making sure folks can access them online safely, securely, right? All that stuff is super important. This is not about throwing technology at folks. It's about making sure that they can do it in the way that meets their needs, that they have the support to do it, and that they can get to whatever their own goals are. Super excited about what's happening here in Columbus, in part super excited because of the coalition building that's occurring here in Columbus. Folks partnering, folks figuring out how to do things together, a lot of learnings that we at NDIA gather from folks in Columbus. Columbus is definitely becoming a leader in this field, and we take those learnings and we share them nationally. The fact that there's so many partnerships going on, that those who have access to certain resources, for example, the library has access to certain resources federally that others don't have access to, and they're working with partners to make the most of those resources. That's beautiful, right? That's what we encourage to happen across the country. The research that Heather's going to describe, we love it so much. We are telling everybody what Columbus is doing with this research and encouraging lots of others to do it. We're telling the federal government that they should encourage all the states to do it, right? Like that's how much of an awesomeness is happening here in Columbus. That federal investment is really important to all of this. Inside that Infrastructure Act, with those billions of dollars, is $65 billion for broadband, right? So $42.5 billion of that is the deployment into mostly rural areas, and then $2.75 billion for digital equity. That was a huge win for digital equity. This is historic, right? Folks in our field were like, what? But at the same time, it's only an investment. That money will be spent and it will be gone, and we will still have people who need digital literacy training. We will still have people who need an internet connection. We will still have people who need a newer computer because theirs busted or it's out of date, right? The challenge with all of this is that it's not a one-time fix. Technology is going to keep changing. So our big thing we have to figure out now is, okay, there's some money coming. It's not here yet. We won't see it until 2023. There's money coming. How do we make the most of that money? How do we change our systems and help those who need the others to have access to the internet, invest in it? Healthcare should be investing in digital equity. Financial systems, investing in digital equity. Retail, right? It's everybody, government, everybody who benefits from more people being able to use the internet securely and safely, they should be investing in all these solutions. So that's a big thing that we're figuring out right now, is how do we do that so that the systems change and that we're ready for the next digital divide? I know lots of folks cringe when I say this. We will never fully solve the digital divide. Like, never. If somebody tells you we're going to bridge the digital divide, you'd be like, you might bridge a digital divide, but you're not going to bridge the digital divide, because that one just keeps growing and growing and growing because technology keeps changing. As technology changes, there's a new divide, right? We now need faster and faster internet. So even though folks had dial-up before, they had DSL, it's insufficient now, right? Now we all want faster, faster, faster. We want more capacity. We don't want it to just stop on us sometimes. It's no longer a measure of, do you have internet or do you not have internet? It's, do you have it reliably? Do you have the speeds that you need? Is it affordable so that you can have it reliably? This is where it gets more complicated, and we have to figure out how to address these moving forward, because there will be some new technology none of us are thinking about right now. And we all need to figure out how we address it quick, right? As we see it coming, let's figure out how to address it. We can't later be like, oh, turns out there was another digital divide. Well, of course there was, because technology keeps changing. So I'm thrilled to be here with you all. I'm thrilled that Columbus is doing everything that it's doing. And I love that NDIA could be supportive of all that. I will put some more links in the chat. We have lots of tools at NDIA. So there's a whole list of them in the link I just shared. And I'll stick my email address in too, because I'm always happy to talk about any of this. And I'm going to pass it over to Heather now.
Thank you, Angela. I'm super excited to be with you all today and to talk about some of the research. Angela, I feel like you set a high bar, so let's see what we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and try and give us. Here we go. So I'm going to share some of that big research that we have done mostly in the last year around digital equity. But first, I want to just give you a frame and a context for the work and the way that we have been thinking about the work here at the foundation. So all of this fits into our community well-being practice, which I'm leading for the foundation. And what that means and looks like for us is two things, right? It's really about how are we measuring well-being in partnership with real people and their real assessment of their lives? And then how are we improving well-being also in partnership with real people? And so that improving well-being is really where a lot of this work is sitting in. And for us, that has looked like embracing design thinking, embracing co-design, and really using this as the building blocks for the way we do our work. And so some of you may be very familiar with that, and some of you may not. But really, what it is, you know, it's interviewing a whole bunch of folks. It's making sense of what we've heard. It's understanding how do we see maybe the problem differently. And then it's actually brainstorming around that and building some prototypes for people to respond to. So it's constantly working with people in the community who are experiencing issues. But we think for us, what really kind of sets our work apart and hopefully gets us to really deep insights and really good solutions on the back end is this design partnership. So for each of the projects we do, this is what it looks like, right? We always have community partners in the room. We always bring design experts in the room. And then for us, we bring lived experts in the room. And those folks are the people who are most proximate to the problem. And these are people who are living the problem. I think as Angela talked about, Wanda, it hopefully would be Miss Wanda's mom who could be in the room with us. And she's part of our problem solving team. And we're gonna pay her for her time and her wisdom. And she is going to help us interview others and make sense of things and create and build solutions. So here is just some representation of all of those different components you see on this screen: design experts, you see partners, and you see community residents, right? These were the teams that staffed each one of our digital equity projects. So I just wanted to share these folks with you all. And I want to show you kind of the breadth of our work for 2021, just to kind of give you a flavor that we've run the gamut from projects involving how do folks feel more belonging inside museums when they are carrying an EBT or a SNAP card and they get free entry into museums, all the way to working with the city on emergency rental assistance. And yet, of our projects last year, 4 of them were focused on digital equity. So I'm going to share with you some big lessons around what we learned, and I'm always happy to take any questions that you all might have. But let's kind of get into this here. We started with some baseline work for us in 2021. And as Angela says, there's so much work, such precedent for such amazing work in this space. But for us, we had started to hear some things about Columbus as we started to engage in the Digital Equity Coalition and do all of that early work that Matt was leading for the foundation. So look, people were like, people experiencing poverty, they're not online, they're not solving problems online, they don't have email addresses, they're not tech savvy. So we said, okay, let's take this as a baseline and let's go a little deeper here. So we said we were really interested in how might we ensure people experiencing poverty could use technology in all the ways they wanted and needed to. So what did we do? We assembled a team with some of those lived experts that you saw there. And we said, let's work through this. And let's interview a host of residents. And design thinking for us is we're not looking for quantitative data, statistically significant. We are really going deep with a few folks, right? So in instances of the work I'll show you here today, we interviewed between 15 and 25 folks. And for us, we're not saying, hey, this is super definitive, but we keep testing the assumptions so that we can get to things that hopefully are very definitive. But what did we hear from residents? So, our screener was folks experiencing poverty. And we heard this, our whole day involves the internet, right? We are on from morning to night, our kids are on, our family is on, it's everything we do. I can't live without it. And, these quotes are representative of all the ones that we heard, but I think what was perhaps most interesting is this woman who passed our screener, and unbeknownst to us, she was staying in a homeless shelter when we did the interview with her. But she walked us through her day in the life and how technology kept showing up for her. So it became pretty clear, wow, these folks that we are talking to, they are very, very connected. We also heard something else though. We heard this idea of, look, we're connected and we're paying for internet, and we might be paying a little, we might be paying a lot, but it's not very good. We heard this story again and again and again. I'm having problems. And the guy says, you just need to upgrade and it will work, but that's more expensive and I can't afford it. We also heard that, hey, if I pay a little and it's crappy, I just get what I get, right? And I don't throw a fit because that's what I guess what I deserve, right? And so we kept hearing these things. And so we also heard this, we had a woman who was getting a GED, who had small children at home, who was paying $176 a month, and was really concerned that she wasn't going to be able to pay for things, right? Or afford that bill, let alone anything else. So we heard a lot of things, I think, in this first project that we did. And, I think it is very fair to say that the residents that we talked to, they were online. And I think that not everyone is, right? They're much, much harder to find, but there were a lot of folks who were engaging with technology. But this idea that, lackluster service is perhaps what you get when you have subsidized offers, or it could also be what you get when you pay a whole bunch, but you might live in a certain neighborhood. We heard discount offers, people didn't know much about them. We also heard this idea for a lot of folks. They said, look, I've been online, I know how to do things online, but I've been taken advantage of before. And I have so little that when you take from me, it really hurts. So they then decided to bifurcate their social activity and their professional activity, right? And they wouldn't do that by themselves, or they wouldn't do those kinds of things online to protect themselves. We also heard this idea that there are absolutely phones, right? As Angela talked about, there were tablets, but there were many fewer laptops, right? One of the things that I want to share with you is a prototype that came out of this particular project. And we thought, after hearing all of these things, after trying to make sense of it, after working with our co-designers, wouldn't it be game-changing to give residents radical transparency and clear understanding of the difference in what the ISPs are actually offering them? So you know what you're paying for, you know what you get, and you know what your neighbor has said about it as well. So we mocked up a very basic prototype, a very basic kind of thing to test with residents. And the thing is, residents loved it. And they said, look, if this existed right now, we would be on it all the time. This is so very helpful. And the exciting part about this and the collaboration is that Smart Columbus was actually able to pick this up and say, you know what, we will do a whole bunch of work and we're going to take this kernel of an idea and build it into an affordable internet comparison tool that residents can use. And so it's really exciting to see these projects come into fruition and hopefully impact the way our community residents experience internet. So that was our first kind of out of the gate. Our second out of the gate was this idea around the South Side and internet. So what we knew is that this is a partnership with the city and with Smart Columbus as well. And the city and Smart Columbus were piloting free internet, right, in the South Side in a very particular neighborhood. And yet, folks weren't clamoring for this free internet. They weren't clamoring for this particular service. So, Smart Columbus asked us to help them think through this. So we brought some co-designers together. We brought some residents in the neighborhood together. So let's interview, let's talk, let's have some conversations. Because the myth was, if you pay too much for internet, or if you have crappy internet, you should be flocking to free internet, right? Alas, that was not exactly what happened. So we set up the project. We wanted to understand, who did people trust? How did they feel about free things? And what role was internet playing? And also this idea of, how does government figure in, right? How does internet figure in general? So what did residents tell us? Residents told us very, very clearly that they did not trust the internet. They were told by doctors in one case, put tape over your mobile phone all the time because it's not safe, right? But it was really, it was actually very serious for folks about how much mistrust they had of internet. Then they went on to talk about their mistrust of government in general for all the reasons, right? And then they went on to talk a lot about their mistrust of free things. Because for these folks, when they heard free, it was either a scam or it was low quality. We had one woman explain to us there was a free toy drive their kids could have been a part of, right? And she was like, why did you pick me out of 1,000 people, right? It doesn't make sense. I don't trust it. And she went on to explain how she made her sister actually try the thing to make sure that it was legit. But there was so much deeply ingrained mistrust that was a real problem, right? So overall, we heard, we don't trust free, we don't trust the government, and we don't trust the internet. So when we bundled all of those things together, when Smart Columbus and the city did, and then came with an offering, it was really tricky. So then it had to be, how do you untangle those things, perhaps charge a little bit? Who are the other community partners that can come in? What could this look and feel like with residents talking to other residents? Because the way it currently stood wasn't going to get the traction that they needed. We also heard this thing that we have heard in so much of our work, where there are only 300 internets to give away. And I am not a technical expert here, right? But as soon as folks and residents heard that number, we had one woman, 5 kids under the age of 3, said, I am extremely low income, and yet I don't want to take from someone else who might need it more than I. So I would not sign up for that, right? So there's the scarcity mentality. And so trying to reimagine, how could you get one for someone and give one? How do you tap into that? And then finally, we heard this also loud and clear. Residents who are transparent and vulnerable are the people that they trust, right? So folks were sharing with us that the leaders in their community who had actually gotten it wrong. And they're like, yeah, when they tell me, hey, I got it wrong, but I tried, and this is why, this is, but please help me. That was so different. And so one of the things that it made us think about as a team is, look, when people heard about this offering, they heard about a beautiful, fancy end offering, and yet it was just a pilot. there were a lot of kinks to work out. So we wondered, might it be better to bring people in on the front end and work with them and say, look, we don't know if this will be better, but please partner with us so that we could make it better for you and for your neighbors. So this is another project that we embarked on, and this was also a Smart Columbus in the city. And this one was kind of a deeper dive into people's homes. And what we did is we really wanted to understand, how was internet showing up for folks in their home? If they had home-based internet, what in fact did that look like, right? What speeds were they getting? What were they paying? What were they experiencing? And so I'm only going to touch on this one briefly, but I think this next graphic is, let me get to the graphic. This is what was fascinating for us. When you looked across the spectrum of the folks we talked to, all of whom, right, were lowest socioeconomic income bracket, right, or 99% of whom were, you saw this mix of the folks we talked to. This is what they were paying per month, right? All the way from nothing to $100 a month. And when you started to really dig into this, the things that we heard, I think that were really interesting, is a lot of folks on the low end said, hey, I don't pay anything, therefore I don't expect anything. Or I pay just a little, it's going to be really bad, but what other options do I in fact have? But then a lot of this green in the middle here, they were folks who believed that if they just paid more, they would get more. It would get better. They would actually have internet that worked for their families. Their kids wouldn't be, crying because they couldn't actually access the thing they needed to. And then we also saw a lot of folks who didn't actually know about these subsidized or low income offers. And perhaps importantly here, each asterisk you see there are folks who showed us real time their past due bills. So they were folks who both believed that if I just pay more, it'll be okay, and folks who couldn't afford it and were being, reprimanded in the process of not being able to afford it. These are some of the quotes that we heard from these folks, but all of this I think is so reflective of that first project that we did in the March timeframe. I don't know what I'm paying for. They're just buy, and they don't explain. People are just kicked off all the time. And if I'm paying like $12 shy of 100, that's not right. And then we heard the speed. They said, look, you're telling us to do speed tests. I am paying for a whole bunch more. What is going to happen now? And I think this last one is what's very interesting. Depending upon what happens with this ISP, my data plan, Cricket, might just be better for me. So this, again, I think was this opportunity to go deep with residents to understand what is a day in your life like and how might we make it better. All right, the last project that I will share with you is one around technology help. And this is really, digital navigators is what we called it. This was really around, I think what Angela was referencing, what's the culturally relevant help? How do people want to be receiving help around technology? What does that look like? So for us, when we looked at the data in Columbus, it seemed like if folks needed technical help, like the folks most likely to need technical help were seniors and new Americans. So we used this design thinking trick where we went to the extremes and said, let's understand the extreme positions. And if we do, we might be able to create something in the middle, right? That serves everyone, create something to serve the extremes, but then also by extension, serve everyone else. So what did we hear? Our co-designer team included new Americans. We had Somali, we had Latina, and we also then had some seniors who joined the team. It was a collective team. It was an incredible team. But we heard on the new American side very clearly, look, these folks that we're working with have 2 to 3 jobs. They don't have time for one more thing. They want to learn the CCS, the Columbus City School Portal, because they need to help their kids, right? But one thing, once they've learned that, their mind is blown. They don't have time or capacity or the headspace for any one more thing, right? And we also heard this idea of sometimes I go to houses to help people, right? And it just kind of takes away a lot of the shame. From the senior side, we heard something a little bit different, right? We heard one of these quotes, my friend thinks that if he has a question, he can just drive downtown and ask someone. I'm trying to tell him there's no one to ask anymore. And we heard from another woman, she said, look, this technology thing, I feel like a canoe on the ocean. And the shame involved in the asking of help and who was giving help and how that felt came up for both groups. And so what this kind of led us to overall for this project is we said, look, some people only want technology for survival purposes. So their learning should look like on demand. It should be urgent, it should be tactical, it should be something that they could keep coming back to. We also heard from seniors, and new Americans, frankly, this idea that technology can be so intimidating and learning about it can be so intimidating. But if there's ways to infuse joy in the learning, you could change everything, right? So that made us think, how do you do more joyful learning? What could that look like around technology? And then also we heard very loud and clear, I got to use technology, or we just heard it the other day, or I'm a dinosaur, right? And so it doesn't feel like a choice. So how, therefore, could you embed lots of choice in how people learn, right? So how could there be lots of different ways they can choose of what might work for them? And then finally, not surprising, right? People don't want to feel stupid and they don't want to feel like a burden. So in any of the learning we offer, in any of the help we give, how do we make sure dignity is at the core and we are hiring people who can absolutely make that front and center in everything that they do? And then finally, this idea of personalized help, right? It's not easy, it's not scalable. And yet, if it helps to reduce shame and it really helps people to get what they need, how do we have more of that, right? So the last thing I will share with you is just kind of our collective, all of the things that we learned, and our hope is that this knowing these things, sharing out the prototypes will in fact make residents' lives better in Columbus when it comes to these issues. So with that, I will stop sharing and perhaps invite everyone to join me.
Thank you, Heather. So if anybody at this time has questions that they want to elevate to either Heather or Angela or Matt, you can feel free to use that Q&A feature. But while we wait for that to get populated, I'll just kick off with the question of, this is clearly a problem. This has been a problem for a while. It is evolving. How can folks in the Central Ohio area help either locally or nationally advance these digital inclusion needs?
Matt, do you want to do local and then I'll do national?
That sounds great. Yeah, I was just going to say, I will drop here in the chat in a moment the address for the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition. I think following the work of that coalition is one of the big keys to that, Hillary. I think, tracking not only the types of emergency, urgent types of needs that have been so common over the last couple of years, but also thinking about what we need to do to be ready to make the most of the continued flow of career opportunities because of the tech sector's growing presence here in Central Ohio, and everything in between. It is about knowing how to turn on a device, how to use it, how to connect to the internet, and then it's about everyone who wants to having access to high-paying career tech fields. So I think following the work of that coalition is one big one locally.
And the foundation has a digital equity fund.
Yep, I can share that one in the chat also.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's also important, Angela. So the Columbus Foundation pretty early on in the pandemic established an emergency response fund through which we made over, I think, $8 million of grants to help nonprofits weather the storm of the pandemic, get through, make sure they could meet urgent needs and timely needs. And it wasn't that far into the pandemic that we started to realize that a lot of the needs that nonprofits were experiencing had something either indirectly or directly to do with technology. and needs not only of the clients and community members that they were serving, but also the nonprofits themselves and their staff. And so in addition to that emergency response fund, we established a separate emergency response fund to support specifically digital equity. And through that fund, we have been able to support a lot of the early learnings and meet a lot of the needs to help build the infrastructure for the coalition here locally, establishing some of the practices and developing some of the insights, supporting even the construction of the website for the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition. So that has been a very important vehicle and will continue to be an important vehicle. And I should say too that when we think about digital equity and funding that work, we're seeing now as we begin to come, we hope, out of the pandemic, that it both needs and merits specific support to fund really intentional initiatives across the community, but it also needs to be a lens through which we look at all grant making here at the foundation. And so when we have donors and supporting foundations with say an interest in education or healthcare, public health, the digital divide and digital equity need to be things that we think about in all of those kinds of grant making as well. So I think that's probably a key to this as well.
Right. So what we saw increase during the pandemic was organizations who didn't do digital inclusion as part of their work started doing digital inclusion because in order to meet their original mission, and this is what Matt is saying, right? Like it's all tied together. So one way that you all could think about it is if you already have an organization that you support, to ask them about how are they addressing the technology needs of their own staff and the individuals that they work with, and might there be another way to like lead them to some of the resources you heard today or to support them in that work. Digital equity hasn't really had funding like until the pandemic. Okay, here's a great example. Prior to the pandemic, NDIA was 3 staff people. We now are at 17. So the realities out there have changed. There's a recognition of the issue. There is federal money coming. So programs may not have existed in some of these organizations that could have the programs and maybe even should have the programs because there was no money to cover those costs. So that's something that's changing, and the recognition of the need is changing. So I think that's a place that you all could be. Nationally, NDIA is viewing this as how do we make sure that that federal money is well spent? And there's activities going on at the local level that's occurring before that federal money even makes it here. Listen, I mean, you heard everything that's happening in Columbus. Columbus is not alone. There's lots of that. So NDIA's role is to help folks make the most of this. We call it this moment in time, right? Folks are paying attention to this issue. Let's make use of this moment in time, make as many gains as we can in that systems level change, so that those organizations are there, they have the capacity, we have a big capacity issue. Who understands digital equity? Well, it was about 6 people. That's an exaggeration, it was way more than that. But it wasn't enough people. So addressing all of the education needs, the training needs of the folks who already serve those, because trust is really important, right? You can't really teach trust as well as you can teach what is digital equity. So supporting organizations who help make those changes, that's one option. Of course, NDIA is always happy to talk. If anybody wants to talk, website again is digitalinclusion.org. I encourage you to just poke around.
All right, so we have another question here from Susan Rector, and that is, where are the schools in all this? It seems that youth have a working knowledge of tech. Schools would seem to know where the need is. Has there been any outreach to find the pockets of need, and who would benefit from those internet upgrades? Matt, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I was just going to add, thanks for the question, Susan. Columbus City Schools and many other school districts locally were thinking about this immediately, of course, and had some pretty substantial federal and state resources to address at least the device gap and access to internet via hotspots. And so pretty early on in the pandemic, districts were providing Chromebooks and internet hotspots to students across their districts. And that, of course, helped alleviate some of the immediate need. But then there were other needs. And so another thing that we saw develop that we were able to support, early in the pandemic was these learning extension centers where, students couldn't obviously congregate in schools at the full student body, but smaller community hubs serving anywhere from half a dozen to a couple dozen students a day or throughout the week. We're able to provide tech support, reliable internet, snacks, things like that in a safe environment with distance and masks and all of those aspects of protocol at the time. But that was another essential aspect of it that wasn't thought about as early as the need for devices and hotspots, but became a really important thing for a lot of schools throughout the community. Technology needs were obviously something that were, a part of a lot of, district line item, budgets and things like that. But I think that schools have learned a lot, not only about their technology needs of their students and families, but about how to use technology more effectively to teach and create innovative learning environments. And so there's some of that work still going on. I think there's going to be a lot of that continuing to go on. And Columbus City Schools has been a committed member and contributor to that Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition. So what they learned, we're learning, and vice versa.
Awesome. So our next question is for Heather. Heather, you mentioned that the people you talked to on the South Side were more likely to listen to leaders who are transparent and vulnerable. When you shared that back with the leaders, how did they translate that information into how they approached the community?
Thank you for the question. I think, I will say this. I think it's always hard to be a community partner in the room for one of these projects. And I applaud every single community partner who said, we want to be in the room with you to do this, because sometimes they hear things that they don't want to hear, right? And sometimes, you're like, we're doing the best that we can and we think that this is right. And when a resident tells you that is not for me, thank you very much, it's hard to hear that. But I think very graciously, when folks heard that, it was like, oh, we need to investigate, right? And they also heard, hey, what you're giving us isn't really working. Oh, we need to investigate. We need to figure out, is it not working? Is the technology not working? And then and then what can we do about it, right? How do we move our devices so that we can get better access, better coverage? And then I think it was also this idea of, okay, how do we spend a lot more time in the front end saying that this is a pilot, this is a prototype, we are trying, this is not the end all be all, but there was a real, I think, leaning into, this isn't a beautiful finished product, but this is something we're going to hopefully learn about and make better together. So I think all of those things were taken on board.
That human-centered design process is absolutely invaluable, and to have the experience of those lived experts. Thank you for sharing, Heather. Angela, this next question is for you. You mentioned that there are people who were surprised to learn that there is a digital divide. Are there any other issues that you think are hiding in plain sight that you'd like to elevate for us all to think about?
Yes, that federal money that's coming, the majority of it's going to rural areas, right? So sometimes that can result in even kind of clamps down on the idea that the digital divide is a rural issue, so that it's about availability of the internet. Availability is a really big problem. Like, we definitely need to address that, but it is one piece of the problem. So there's sometimes some misunderstanding about that, that yes, we need to address availability. And then it's not just about whether it's there or whether it's not there. It is, can folks afford it? Is it the speed they need? Here in Central Ohio, we have availability. Is it fast enough? Is it the right speed? So what ends up happening is that folks rely upon their mobile phones rather than a wireline connection, because it's more useful, right? You can make phone calls with it, you can take it with you. And so then they don't have both sometimes, as they would need both. So that becomes it, so it's more complicated, right? It's how do we address all those barriers? So not only is the internet connection, but then the computer and the digital literacy skills. I think one of the perception barriers we need to overcome is that, well, we're just going to bridge the digital divide. We're going to do this project. We're going to throw a few $1 million over here, and then we're all going to be done. That is not going to happen, and folks are going to be sorely disappointed when the outcomes aren't what they are hoping to achieve.
Yeah. Our next question is to nobody in particular, but it is understood that pregnant people who attend prenatal appointments have improved birth outcomes. Has there been any discussion about how this work could intersect with fighting to reduce infant mortality and maternal mortality rates?
Yeah, so if you are familiar with the initiative Celebrate One, which is part of the City of Columbus's effort to address the infant mortality gap, they, as part of their most recent strategic plan for the next several years, are going to be standing up an innovation hub. They're thinking out kind of on the Far East side. And part of the idea will be to do pilot projects and to introduce more access to technology as a way of addressing that very thing. Now, that's one key initiative through which we might, as a community, learn quite a bit from. But this is also something that, as I think Angela pointed out, like the healthcare systems all need to really be thinking about it, because there are public health gains to be made through digital inclusion, and there are likely financial cost savings to be had throughout healthcare systems and financial systems when people have access to these. So, I mean, I've heard some statistics about like nationwide children's hospitals telehealth appointment rate before and after the pandemic. It's you wouldn't believe how many more appointments are happening now through telehealth, and that both increases access to providers and reduces costs, but it only works if everyone has the access, the devices that they need. So I think really system-wide, community-wide, it really needs to be part of our thinking.
Thanks. Heather, did you want to add something?
Yeah, one thing I'll add just super quickly is for our co-designers, so we've worked with 60 to 70 people at this point in the last 2 years, I guess, virtually doing this work. And because of the Digital Equity Fund, we were able to actually equip those folks with computers and with hotspots that they're theirs to use. But it's so fascinating because, these are folks who are receiving benefits. I mean, they're definitely experiencing poverty, and they will tell us, hey, I don't have to come transportation for you. You're going to pay me and I get to engage. And, and so I feel like in the same way that Matt's talking about showing up for an appointment, when you take away transportation like that, lots of things can change. And when people get their devices and, I get these text messages of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I now have a hotspot and a thing, so I can do this at my house. This changes everything. So I just offer that up as an anecdote as well.
Thank you. And it looks like we're about out of time for today, but there are a couple more questions. So I will, if folks want to email me directly after this, we can also answer those questions that way. And if you'd like to continue this conversation in any other form, also please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name's Hillary Stone. My email address is hstone@columbusfoundation.org. You can also read about ways to respond to this important challenge in our most recent Advancing Your Philanthropy e-newsletter, which landed in your inboxes yesterday. Thank you to today's presenters, Angela Siefer, Heather Tsavaris, and Matthew Martin. Angela, with gratitude for your time today, the Columbus Foundation is making a grant of $500 to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. So thank you again. And thanks to all of you in our donor community who were able to join us today for this presentation as we work toward our promise of helping you help others through the most effective philanthropy possible. Go forth and do good things. Have a good day. Thanks all.